Hi, welcome back to my garden. This week I'd like to talk about personal change and development, obviously intimately linked to what we've been exploring over the last few weeks, the idea of self-actualization. I thought I'd begin by kind of trying to visualize personal change a little bit better. And I'll do that through the lens of mathematics, through graphs. Well, hardly surprising, I was a maths teacher for a couple of decades. And even for those of you out there who are perhaps tend to more towards the math-phobic side of life, don't worry, I'm going to keep this fairly straightforward, just use it as a framing device. So if we think about our personal change, personal development over time, a handy way of visualizing it is as a graph on the Cartesian XY plane. X-axis, the horizontal axis, we have time, and on the vertical Y-axis, we have an element of our life and how it develops. Now, let's put aside for a moment the thorny question of whether our personal development actually can just be reduced to numbers. Obviously, certain elements of our life can be. Personal wealth. Well, that's very easy to enumerate. Our health, whilst it's maybe a more all-encompassing and complex topic, probably could be measured in terms of a basket of numerical metrics, your weight and things like that. But let's forget whether it's easy to measure or not. Let us just imagine that there's an ideal view of yourself, the 100% totally self-actualized you, and the sort of 0% at the moment of your inception, sort of birthing into the world. And look at how that changes over time. Now, one popular sort of visual model of that, certainly when I was growing up, would have been essentially linear, that you learn things, gradually patch together the necessary qualities and components for a good life, and that you accrue these things over time and gradually march onwards and upwards towards the ideal version of you as a fully mature adult. A sort of American dream of how things might be. A parental dream if you're a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s in a sort of ordinary middle-class family in the Western world. Well, those ideas in the 21st century have pretty much been debunked. This kind of sensible life that follows common sense rules and has a happy ending. It doesn't seem to be that relevant today at all. And one of the things that's replaced it in terms of trying to view your life is a very different model. And certainly a lot of the self-improvement gurus on the internet will talk about a different kind of mathematical concept, not an inexorable onwards and upwards straight line, but they will talk about the compound principle, the idea of exponential growth. And not just greedy Westerners in the YouTube sphere of the virtual world, but even in more a more gentle worldview, perhaps, I'm not sure quite how to phrase this, a more philosophical Oriental view, well, the concept is floating around there just to the same degree. This idea of Kaizen, Japanese words, notion, package of making very small improvements but doing them consistently over time. And again, the effect, it's the same thing, compounds. So that could be a very nice model looking at how one might move towards this mythical state of self-actualization, or the idealized version of yourself. And for a moment, I'm not, let's put again to one side this idea of whether this is measurable, and let's also put to one side the idea of self-actualization is more than just making yourself a shinier version of you, a more successful version of you. Let's forget about that for a moment. Just imagine that it was simply this graphical picture. That leaves out a very useful type of mathematical graph, mathematical functions, that I think we need to examine within this paradigm. And that is not the linear functions, not just the exponential nonlinear functions, but functions, graphs that have points of discontinuity. What are those, you might ask? You might have forgotten. Well, there are certain graphs that aren't just a continuous, unbroken line, but they have a point of rupture. And many of these graphs, that point of rupture coincides with what is called an asymptote, a sort of a dotted line that the graph can't touch. In the world of maths, this comes about because you've broken oftentimes broken a fundamental mathematical law. You can't divide by zero. And so we have these points, these lines of discontinuity in our graph. And I think it's a very nice way of looking at our personal development and change. It isn't just a continuous line, whether straight or bumpy, curvy, really doesn't matter. It's our life development has these critical moments dotted across its course of moments of ruptures, of extreme discontinuity, when something happens that changes us profoundly forever. Now, that's quite an extreme way of looking at it, and I've spoken about these sorts of things before on this channel. One of my videos, I unpicked a curious thing that I'd noticed. The proliferation of books written by people who went to prison, and it was a turning point in their life, and they were kind of discovered who they really were meant to be, and the books maps out these changes that they underwent. And I've said before that in a way we kind of all need we need experiences like that, but they don't necessarily have to be negative. If you look at a much more old school tradition view of how I suppose my parents might have envisaged life, is you carry on, and at a certain point, you probably get married. And that is a rupture, a massive, complete upheaval. And it will be a change that changes you literally forever. So these kind of experiences, I think, are critical in terms of our path towards self-actualization. And the extreme versions are simply magnified examples of what the philosopher and writer L.A. Paul, I got that right, I keep on stumbling because L.A. Paul, Lauren Paul, is a philosophy lecturer at the University University, North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And so I kept on wanting to say L.A. Hill. I guess the rapper, Lauryn Hill, was that her name? Anyway, that's neither here nor there. And I haven't actually read her book. I've watched a couple of the videos, and I came across all of this in a newsletter. Isn't that always the way with me? That I received from a writer, Maria Popova, called The Marginalia. Very, very interesting sort of philosophical, gentle musings about life, the universe, and everything. Well, Lauren Paul talks about, and has written an entire book about what she calls transformative experiences. And transformative experiences are ones that are not just not just things that change us epistemically, and by that she means we know something new, but also change us personally in terms of our views and our values. And not everything falls into both categories at the same time. It's a sort of a transformative experience is a intersection point, I'm staying with the maths, of a Venn diagram, where we have the things that change our knowledge and the things that change our values. So, for example, if you had a problem, you were colorblind, and you finally saw the color red, it might change your knowledge. You can't possibly know what the color red is until you've seen it, but might not have changed your worldview. Equally, you might have read a poem that told you nothing new, or a work of fiction, but completely changed how you viewed the world, shifted you seismically. But a transformative experience is one that changes both these elements. She uses an example, one of the many examples apparently in her book. Consider the following. Imagine that someone offered you the chance to become a vampire, offered you the bite that would change you forever. And let's just imagine for a moment that this would be, first of all, painless, and secondly, morally sound. They were ethical vampires that ate organically raised, or drank blood from organically raised cattle. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument. Now, the problem in trying to decide whether to accept this or not is the problem of an asymmetry. And this is kind of connected with this whole idea of a point of rupture in the graph of our life. Because we are very, very familiar with what it's like to be a person with our past life. We have no idea, and indeed, rationally speaking, we can have no idea of what it will be like to be a vampire. I mean, they can give us very compelling reasons as to why we might take them up on the offer. Superpowers and living forever. Those would be wonderful. The truth is, in our lives, we tend frequently to vastly overvalue the experiences that we've already had above things that might be fantastic in the future, but we have no way of really knowing what they will be like. I mean, this is the stuff on which fascist dictators build much of their argument. The golden past that you remember, whether it was like that or not is another question, versus the uncertain and terrifying future that someone is suggesting we move blindly into. But the argument that I want to make is that we absolutely must have those transformative experiences in our life. They are vital if we are to make real progress, and certainly if we're to move towards this fairly hard to pin down state of self-actualization. Now, this video, for whatever reasons, has proved hard to condense. I've made it a few times into something shorter. So I guess this is part one of a two-part story. Perhaps you have some questions, comments. As always, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, I trust your lives are filled with joy. And until next week, from sunny Brazil,